Okay, in lesson 1.2, we're going to learn about points, line segments, lines, and rays. Okay. Let's call this A. Let's call this point, point B. We can call this point, point C. And we can call this point, point D. When they're by themselves, they're just that. They're just a point, nothing more. But when we connect two points, we make what's called in geometry a line segment. And we can call this line segment AB. When we connect points C and D, we call this line segment CD. Okay? You'll notice that a line segment starts here and it stops here. Okay? We can measure it to the nearest inch, almost 5 inches, or to the nearest centimeter, about 12 centimeters. Okay? Because it stops here, we call this in geometry an endpoint. And because it starts here, we call this in geometry an endpoint. So what will we call this? Point C. What else can we call it? And what else can we call this point D? Well, if you said endpoint, you're correct. This is also called an endpoint because it's where our line segment ends. Okay? But in geometry, sometimes they don't end on both sides. Sometimes in geometry, you're going to see one point where it ends, and you might see another point where it keeps going and keeps going and going and going. Right? When it ends and it keeps going, we call this a ray. Okay? It reminds me a lot of a sun ray, because a sun ray, it starts at the sun, and then it just keeps going on and 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 on forever and ever. Okay? So we call this a ray when it starts in one place and it just keeps going the other direction. Okay? So, again, when it stops in one or starts there and it keeps going in the opposite direction, we call it a ray. On this ray, you could have other points. You could have a point B, you could have a point C, and you could even have a point D on this one, but it's still going to be a ray because it keeps going and going and going forever or indefinitely. Okay? Now, what would we call something that keeps going in both directions? It keeps going in this direction and it keeps going in that direction. Well, in geometry, if it doesn't have an endpoint, and it doesn't have an endpoint, and it just keeps going in both directions, well, in geometry, we simply just call that a line. We call it a line because, as you can see, it keeps going forever over here, and it keeps going forever and ever and ever over here, and over here it just keeps going forever and ever and ever, and it will never ever stop. We can't measure it because it'll go on forever. So, to recap, today in 1.2, we learned about points, we learned about line segments that happen when we connect those points, we learned about rays that keep going in one direction, and we also learned about lines. So this, like I said, we can just simply call it point A. This we can call point B. When we connect the two, we can call it line segment AB, and we can measure it. Okay. Over here, we have a point C and a point D. When we connect the two, we have what's called a line segment. It starts here, stops here. It doesn't go any further. But if it does keep going in one direction, we call it a ray. When it keeps going in one direction. And rays can have points alongside it. There might be a point here that we want to look at. There might be a point here. There might be a point here. When, in geometry, we have something that keeps going in both directions, we call this a line because they go on forever and ever and ever and ever. And that's all we're going to talk about. with respect to points, line segments, rays, and lines.